We are wrestling today with this paradox that really seems to define modern American life.
It really does. It's this paradox of potential abundance. I mean, technically, we live in an era of pure wonder, right?
Right.
Our sources talk about a future we can already sort of picture. You know, vertical farming yielding crops year-round, AI possibly shortening work weeks, lab-grown meats, even Mach 2 air travel.
Wow, New York to London faster than commuting across town.
Exactly. That kind of potential is there.
But the lived reality, it feels very different for most people, doesn't it? Our sources make it abundantly clear it's one of, well, crushing unaffordability, systemic delays, widespread shortages, especially when you look at the absolute basics. Finding a home, getting cheap energy, decent transportation.
So the big question is why? Why is the future feeling so expensive and frustrating? And that's really our mission today. We are diving into sources that pretty aggressively challenge the idea that scarcity is just some inevitable economic law like gravity or something.
Right, like it just has to be this way.
Exactly. The core thesis we're untagging today is, well, pretty simple. Scarcity isn't some cosmic thing. It's a choice. It's driven by this decades-long failure to invent, sure, but also to implement technology and, maybe most critically, a systemic failure to just build the things we need.
And this isn't really a left or right issue, is it? This structural problem seems to cut right across political lines. It's not just about taxes or spending levels.
No, it's deeper. It's about these structural barriers that just stop supply from meeting demand.
It reminds me of President Biden during that inflation crisis, talking about high car prices. He laid out the choice really clearly. He said, you either increase the supply of cars by making more of them, or you reduce demand for cars by making Americans poorer. That's the choice.
And that's a fundamentally supply-side way of framing the problem, isn't it?
That is.
It signals that this issue, this failure to build that's been lurking for years, it's finally moving right to the center of national politics.
Okay.
But to really grasp the sheer scale of this self-imposed constraint, this choice we've made, we have to look first at the clearest, maybe the most heartbreaking example.
Housing.
Housing. Yeah, let's dive into that. Housing really is the perfect case study, I think, because the numbers, the raw numbers, they just show this systemic structural crisis. It's something that you can't just fix with individual budget cuts or, saving a bit more.
Not at all.
Let's start with a data point that, frankly, should shock everyone listening. Get this. In 1950, the median American home price was just 2.2 times the average annual income.
Wow. 2.2 times.
Yeah. Which meant that, working class folks, middle class families, within a few years of working, they could reasonably expect to afford a starter home. That was the deal. That was the American dream, basically. But fast forward just 70 years to 2020, and that ratio, it jumped dramatically to 6 times the average annual income.
6 times.
6 times. I mean, think about that. For the average American family today, just trying to save up for a down payment on a home, it often feels like a hopeless task.
It really illustrates how the economic growth we have had over the last 50 years, well, it hasn't been spread evenly, has it? And some of these core necessities, the literal foundation of that dream, have gotten so much harder, often just impossible to reach.
And it's not just the sticker price of the house itself.
Right. It connects to other things.
It really does. Look at the rising cost of other core things, which kind of reflect the same scarcity problem. Take health insurance.
Okay.
Between 1999 and 2023, the average premium for an employer-based family health insurance plan went from just under $6,000 a year.
Okay, I remember those days.
To nearly $24,000.
$24,000.
That's over a 300% increase. So even if your wages went up a little bit, these huge unavoidable costs just eat up any raise you might have gotten.
Yeah, it vanishes.
These are the hidden costs of stagnation, right? The scarcity just piling up in every necessary part of life. And what our sources really pinpoint as the fundamental economic mistake underlying all this is viewing economic growth as simply making the pie bigger.
That phrase, making the pie bigger, it's everywhere, isn't it? But I think the sources really show why it just doesn't capture what true abundance is about.
Yeah, it fails because real economic growth isn't just, quantitatively adding more of the same thing. It's qualitative change. It's innovation.
Okay, explain that difference.
Well, imagine you somehow magically grew a blueberry pie. You just get more blueberry pie, right? Maybe enough for 1,000 people instead of 10. Big pie.
Still just pie.
Exactly. But true abundance comes from a qualitative leap. Think about, say, New York City between 1875 and 1905. You go from a city relying on horses, oil lamps, no cars, no electric light, to one with skyscrapers, automobiles, aspirin, photographs.
That's a transformation.
That's not a bigger pie. That's a whole new feast, built from totally different ingredients. And that kind of adaptation, that innovation, is what drives real abundance. But crucially, it requires building things rapidly and often disruptively.
And that capacity for disruptive adaptation, for building new things where people actually need them, that seems to be exactly what broke down, especially in the cities that should have been the engines of this new abundance.
Mm-hmm. There's this interesting paradox noted by the economist Ed Glaeser. Cities, which are essentially just, the absence of physical space between people.
Right. Listen.
They theoretically should have become less valuable as long-distance communication got cheaper, right? With the internet, Zoom calls. Why fly to meet someone?
Makes sense, but that's not what happened.
No. The exact opposite happened. Proximity became more valuable because the economy shifted, right? From making physical stuff to making ideas and services. And these complex sort of cognitive tasks, they're best created and refined in tight physical clusters. Think Silicon Valley.
Yeah, that constant interaction, competition.
Exactly. Look at the Bay Area right now, concentrating these global generative AI companies within like a tiny radius. The value of being right there just skyrocketed.
But the sources show there's this massive financial penalty for being there, for that concentration. Like, before the 1980s, wages in New York City were actually unusually high. Even after you adjusted for the cost of living, you were basically paid well to live there because your skills were needed.
Right. It compensated you.
But by the year 2000, that completely flipped. Moving to New York, for most people, meant an effective pay cut because housing costs just exploded. The sources put it really bluntly. People now pay to live there. They aren't paid to live there.
And this brings us right into the political fight, doesn't it?
Yeah.
This is where scarcity connects directly to politics. Specifically, politics rooted in housing as an asset, as an investment. There's this observation from the journalist Jerusalem Demsis that feels like one of the deepest truths we're looking at today. She says, at the core of American housing policy is a secret hiding in plain sight. Homeownership works for some because it cannot work for all.
Wait, hang on. That sounds really zero-sum, almost un-American, Is there really no way forward politically where current owners can protect their investment and newcomers can afford a place? Are those goals just fundamentally incompatible?
Well, the sources suggest that unless you totally redefine homeownership, away from this expectation of constant, significant appreciation, the conflict is pretty much inescapable.
Why?
Because think about it. If you want housing to be genuinely affordable for everyone, it needs to be cheap, dense, and widely available. You essentially have to flood the market with supply.
Okay, lots of homes.
But if you want housing to function primarily as a wealth-building vehicle, like an investment, its value has to increase significantly faster than inflation over time, which means it needs to be scarce and desirable.
So abundant supply pushes prices down, scarcity pushes them up.
Exactly. Those two goals are fundamentally opposed. And our current system overwhelmingly prioritizes incumbent homeowners, the people already in the market, over the newcomers trying to get in.
And that system wasn't an accident. It was built through policy, right? Starting largely in the 1970s. We talk about zoning, but it wasn't always this exclusionary tool it seems to be today.
That's right. When James Metzenbaum described early zoning, he literally called it good housekeeping.
Good housekeeping.
Yeah, keeping the noise and industry out of residential areas, making sure the kitchen stove stayed out of the parlor, basically. It was just about separating incompatible uses. Sensible enough.
But then something shifted.
Yeah, by the 1970s, it rapidly morphed into this powerful tool for anti-growth regulation, a tool for, frankly, gatekeeping and creating scarcity.
You can see this transformation really clearly in California's history, can't you? Post-World War II, you had places like Lakewood. Just epitomizing this building frenzy, they were completing a new home literally once every 7.5 minutes between 1950 and 1953.
7.5 minutes. It's astonishing. It was a machine churning out supply.
But then contrast that with the later movements, like Petaluma putting explicit growth controls in place in the 70s, deliberately putting quotas and clamps on construction.
And the logical endpoint of all those policies? It came in 2020. For the first time in the state's entire history, California, a state with immense wealth, progressive political leadership, actually shrank in population.
Wow. They chose process and preservation over supply.
They did.
The sources label this a consequence of lawn sign liberalism. which is quite a term.
It is. It describes that political phenomenon where, residents in wealthy, often progressive zip codes, they put up yard signs saying Black Lives Matter or We Believe Science.
Like showing support for social justice.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
While simultaneously using every tool available, local zoning hearings, environmental lawsuits, you name it, to block any multifamily affordable housing project that might bring more people, different kinds of people, and maybe, just maybe, lower property values into their neighborhood.
So the signs say one thing, the actions say another.
Precisely. And the really devastating outcome of this manufactured scarcity, it's endemic homelessness.
Now, this is a really contentious point. Many people, particularly on the right, often frame homelessness as primarily about individual failings, poverty, addiction, mental illness.
Right, as a moral feeling almost.
Right.
But the data from our sources paints a very different picture. It shows it's overwhelmingly a direct consequence of a housing supply crisis.
The musical chairs analogy used in the sources really clarifies this brilliantly, I thought.
It does, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Imagine that game. If you have 10 chairs and 10 people playing, everyone gets a seat. Doesn't matter if someone's older or on crutches or struggling with addiction, everyone sits. But take away just one chair. Now you have 9 chairs and 10 people. Someone will be left out. Now, individual circumstances, poverty, addiction, mental illness, they might predict who is most likely to be left standing when the music stops.
Okay, so those factors determine who loses out.
Yes, but the cause of someone losing out in the first place is the housing scarcity, the simple lack of chairs.
And the evidence seems pretty overwhelming when you compare states, right?
Absolutely. California, the state that has probably done the most to restrict housing supply through local controls and regulations, has 6 times the per capita homelessness rate of West Virginia.
6 times, even though West Virginia has significantly higher rates of poverty and addiction.
Exactly. The critical difference isn't the individual issues, it's the cost of basic shelter. It's the availability of chairs.
And this scarcity wasn't just about stopping new building, was it? It was also about getting rid of existing affordable options.
That's a crucial piece. Historically, things like boarding houses were everywhere. They were a common low-cost option for single workers, for people down on their luck. Small rooms, shared bathrooms, basic, but far better than living under a bridge.
They were like the bottom rung on the housing ladder. You could at least get on it.
Precisely. But over time, zoning codes and building regulations were updated, demanding ever more features. Minimum lot sizes, mandatory parking spaces per unit, even if people didn't own cars. Requirements for full private kitchens and bathrooms for every single tenancy.
And these weren't always just about safety, were they?
Often not. These regulations were frequently, and sometimes quite intentionally, designed to remove what the sources call a continued toehold in richer neighborhoods. They effectively eliminated an entire category of necessary, low-cost housing supply.
So homelessness isn't some unsolvable mystery then?
Not according to these sources. It's the predictable, even calculated result of many, many small policy choices over decades that prioritize things like home value appreciation and neighborhood aesthetics over the fundamental need of meeting the housing needs of the entire population.
Okay, so that same kind of paralysis we see in housing, it's also crippling our ability to do big things, right?
Right.
Like large-scale infrastructure, energy projects.
Oh, definitely. We turn now to public works, and it's the same story. Ambition, especially the ambition to build, say, a green future, it just collides head-on with this impossible process. And it seems particularly bad in liberal-dominated states.
And the poster child for this, it has to be the California high-speed rail project, doesn't it?
It's the ultimate tragic farce of procedural failure. I mean, think about the timeline. Voted for back in 2008, federally backed by the Obama administration in 2009, it was a signature reinvestment project.
Yeah, shovel-ready projects.
Exactly. And the promise was San Francisco to Los Angeles travel by 2020. That was the dream.
And the reality.
The reality is that dream just evaporated. By the 2020s, the project had totally collapsed into this plan for a highly localized, short line connecting 2 inland farming centers, Merced and Bakersfield.
Not quite SF to LA.
Not even close. And the estimated cost for just that short segment, $35 billion. And get this, even that tiny piece isn't expected to carry passengers until sometime between 2030 and 2033.
Wow, that's potentially a quarter century of planning for less than 200 miles of track.
And this is the absolute crucial point for you listening. The failure wasn't the technology. High-speed rail exists all over the world. It wasn't a fundamental lack of money. billions were allocated.
So what was it?
Pure procedural negotiation and bureaucracy. Just endless fighting. Construction faced repeated moratoriums because of disputes with busy freight lines that own the right-of-way. The environmental review process had started in 2012, and by 2024, it still wasn't finished.
12 years of environmental review.
Unbelievable, right? So the actual task that consumes the time and the billions of dollars isn't pouring concrete or laying track, it's negotiating. Negotiating with courts, with individual homeowners, with farm owners, with dozens of public agencies, each one having some kind of veto point.
Which leads us to this fundamental construction puzzle. Why? Why, despite all the amazing tech advances since the 1970s, computer modeling, drones, sophisticated power tools, prefab materials, why is construction taking longer and costing more in real dollars?
It seems completely counterintuitive, doesn't it?
Oh, boy.
But productivity is actually falling in construction globally, even with better tech. There's OECD data that tracked construction productivity in 29 countries between 96 and 2019. In over half of them, 55% productivity actually fell. Any time saved by a new power tool is completely wiped out, and then some by the exponential increase in paperwork and process required to use it.
That sounds almost like hyperbole, but there's that anecdote from the construction veteran Ed Zarensky.
Yeah, it paints a really clear picture. Zarensky noted that modern projects now require hundreds more people in the office to track and bring to completion.
Hundreds more people in the office. Doing what?
They're tracking compliance, federal, state, local regulations. They're managing liability, filling out environmental impact forms, coordinating with insurance brokers. All that energy, all those salaries are diverted from the physical act of building itself. The complexity became the job.
And this complexity gets kind of systematized by what the economist Mancur Olson called the organizations of affluence. What's that about?
Olson's theory was that affluent, stable societies like post-WWII America that avoid major revolutions or collapses, they naturally build up these powerful, persistent, organized groups. Think AARP, labor unions, the Sierra Club.
Okay, interest groups.
Right. And these groups are incredibly important for democracy, no question. They represent specific values, specific interests. But Olson's key insight was that the more organized groups you have in a society, the more layers of negotiation, complex regulations, and fights over who gets what get added onto every single significant project.
And because these groups are persistent, they rarely just give up or compromise easily.
Exactly. They dig in. The result is often project stasis. Gridlock.
The comparison to China here is just so stark, isn't it? China builds tens of thousands of miles of high-speed rail in the time California struggled with one small segment.
It's jarring. Now, that speed comes at a significant cost, right? Often imperiously overriding local concerns, environmental issues.
Sure, there are downsides.
But it illustrates that speed is primarily a function of power and procedural simplicity, not necessarily just raw engineering talent. They could just do it.
And Olson actually predicted that in a society bogged down by this complexity, the rewards shift dramatically.
Yeah, he predicted that the most lucrative and highly rewarded jobs would shift away from the people who actually create and build things, the engineers, the architects.
To who?
To the people who navigate the complexity, from the lawyers, the lobbyists, the management consultants. The system starts rewarding the complexity navigators more than the builders.
That is deeply frustrating. It kind of explains why Patrick Collison, the CEO of Stripe, once suggested the internet is the frontier of last resort for ambitious people.
Right, because trying to do ambitious physical projects like high-speed rail is just too slow and maddening in the U.S. today.
Yeah.
You can literally build a multi-billion-dollar AI company faster than you can get permits to lay a few hundred miles of track. It's wild.
And this structural overcomplexity seems to have a particular flavor, especially on the progressive side of politics, which the sources call everything bagel liberalism. What does that mean?
It's a memorable term. It describes this pathology where reformers, often with the very best intentions, try to layer too many worthy, crucial goals onto a single project. They want the project to achieve everything simultaneously.
Like what? Give me an example.
Okay, so say you're building affordable housing. The project doesn't just need to provide housing. It also needs to meet the highest environmental standards, be fully accessible for people with disabilities, maybe give preference to veterans, have special air filtration systems because it's near a road.
All good things individually.
Absolutely, all worthy goals. But the project ends up collapsing under the sheer weight and complexity of all these conflicting requirements. The cost overruns in affordable housing programs are probably the clearest proof of this.
Right. You mentioned Los Angeles's Proposition HHH earlier.
Exactly. This was a massive city bond measure meant to fund housing for the homeless, a critical need. But the average cost per unit built under HHH spiraled up to around $600,000.
$600,000 per unit for affordable housing. That's insane.
It is. To put it in perspective, there's almost twice the median sale price for an entire single-family house in Houston, a city famous for having no zoning restrictions.
How on earth does a small apartment cost $600,000 to build?
It's the procedure. It's the everything bagel problem. The developer doesn't just get one check from the city. No, they have to cobble together funding from 4, 5, sometimes 6 different sources. You've got low-income housing tax credits, local incentives, state grants, federal grants.
And each one has its own rules.
Exactly. Each funding source comes with its own incredibly detailed, often completely conflicting set of demands and timelines. So, for example, the state environmental review might say, okay, this project needs 2 years of mitigation work before you can start.
Okay.
But then a federal tax credit program says, nope, you need to be shovel-ready within 6 months, or you lose the funding.
Oh, boy.
Or another funding stream might require super expensive high-end air filtration systems because the site is near a freeway, adding maybe $50,000 per unit. Which sounds good, right?
Yeah.
Clean air. Except the alternative for the person who might live there is literally sleeping in a tent under that same freeway, breathing unfiltered air at 247. The perfect becomes the enemy of the good, or even the necessary.
So the very worthy goals of, say, accessibility and environmental standards, they inadvertently make the project so costly and so delayed that it fails its primary mission, which was to quickly and cheaply build housing for the most vulnerable people.
Precisely. The intention is pure gold, but the process becomes self-defeating. And you see this pattern even in critical national security initiatives.
Like the GPS Act.
Yeah, the GPS and Science Act.
Yeah.
Huge bill, right? Intended to bring semiconductor manufacturing back to the U.S. clear national security priority. But the initial notice of funding opportunity, the rules for getting the money, it was criticized by some for not being laser-focused on just speed and cost reduction.
What else was in there?
Well, applicants also needed to address things like climate resiliency plans, community impact agreements, detailed diversity goals, again, all laudable objectives in isolation. But when you complicate the core mission, which was beating global competitors in manufacturing primacy, you risk delays and complexities that could defeat the entire competitive purpose of the bill. It's the everything bagel again.
Okay, let's shift focus a bit now to science and invention, because the story there seems to be, well, depressingly similar. Bureaucracy, institutional risk aversion reigning supreme, and again, tied to this critical, cautious shift that seems to have happened back in the 1970s. We just stopped betting big on truly groundbreaking blue sky research.
That's exactly right. There's this really telling kind of cautionary tale from James Rothman, who won the Nobel Prize in Medicine in 2013.
Okay.
He reflected on his career and said he was profoundly grateful to have started back in the 1970s. Why? Because back then, he felt the federal government was willing to take much bigger risks on young, unproven scientists like him.
Bigger risks how?
Well, he recalled that they basically allowed him 5 years of relative failure, 5 years where his experiments weren't really working out, before he achieved his first real sign of success. He seriously doubted he'd get that kind of patient, long-term support today.
Wow, 5 years of runway to potentially fail.
Exactly. And that kind of patient support, that willingness to fund exploration without guaranteed results, that seems to be exactly what's missing now. The NIH, the National Institutes of Health, this massive engine of American health research, is now often criticized, even internally sometimes, for becoming profoundly risk-averse.
How so? Risk-averse?
Well, the focus seems to have shifted towards funding only projects that are practically guaranteed to succeed. You know, safe science, incremental improvements.
Because researchers know that to actually get a grant, you need to show preliminary data suggesting success, right? You can't just walk in with a truly radical, high-risk idea that might lead to a spectacular failure.
Exactly. Even if that failure would generate massive learning, you can't propose it. This whole phenomenon is apparently satirized beautifully within scientific circles. There's this one famous essay comparing NIH grant reviewers to King Ferdinand.
King Ferdinand?
Yeah, demanding that Christopher Columbus first sail a known, shorter, safer route to Portugal before he attempts the unknown Atlantic.
Huh. Prove you can do the easy thing first.
Right. The logic being, well, it can't fail now, can it? Besides, you sailed to Portugal before, so the study section would know you could do it. The system is basically designed to reward known competence, not necessarily disruptive innovation.
And the real-world cost of this caution, this preference for safe bets, it's maybe clearest in the absolutely stunning story of Catalin Carrico and the mRNA vaccines.
Well, Carrico's story is just incredible. It's a testament to sheer, stubborn persistence against a really rigid system. I mean, she was actually demoted at the University of Pennsylvania because her research into mRNA was considered too fringe, too risky.
Demoted for the work that led to the COVID vaccines.
Yes. And she repeatedly applied to the NIH for funding for her core mRNA work. And she never got a dime of direct U.S. government funding for those projects.
Why not? What was the pushback?
Reviewers consistently rejected her proposals. They often stated that mRNA was too unstable or maybe too toxic. It just wasn't a good therapeutic approach. Too far out there.
So the breakthrough that literally saved countless lives during the pandemic, how did it happen then?
Years later. And it was sparked by, honestly, a near-cosmic accident. A chance encounter she had with an immunologist named Drew Weissman at a university photocopier, all places, back in 1997.
At the photocopier? You're kidding.
Nope, that's the story. And they ended up using funds sort of cobbled together from Weissman's other research on HIV and maybe some small grants awarded to some of Carrico's more successful colleagues. It wasn't a direct bet on her idea.
So it shows that when the pandemic hit, the critical technology was ready, not because our funding system robustly supported these kinds of blue-sky, high-risk ideas.
No, not at all. It was ready because this incredibly dedicated outsider refused to quit, even though the system actively rejected her work at pretty much every turn. The innovation pathway depended on incredible persistence, defiance, and, frankly, a huge dose of luck.
And this pervasive caution stands in such sharp contrast to the success we have seen with targeted implementation models. It proves that when the government decides to cut the red tape and focus purely on speed and scale, it can still achieve miracles.
Operation Warp Speed, OWS. It's the perfect shining example. It delivered effective COVID vaccines in just 10 months. 10 months. The traditional timeline is usually a decade, maybe longer.
How did they do it so fast?
OWS succeeded because it deliberately went back and copied the successful model the U.S. used during World War II to mass-produce penicillin.
Penicillin. What was the model?
Basically 3 things. Coordinate the research efforts, don't let them work in silos. 2, critically underwrite massive manufacturing capacity before the final product is even proven to work. Bet on production. And 3, accelerate the regulatory approval process.
That focus on manufacturing capacity seems key. I remember Monsef Slaoui, who headed OWS, apparently often told his team, science is the easy part. The hard part will be manufacturing this stuff at scale.
Exactly. They realized that having a working vaccine in a tiny vial in a lab was totally useless if you couldn't produce hundreds of millions of doses, like yesterday.
Right. Scale is everything in a crisis.
And the return on investment for this focused, build-oriented approach was just stunning. OWS cost less than $40 billion total. Peanuts in federal budget terms. Yet it's estimated to have prevented up to 20 million excess deaths worldwide.
20 million.
And saved the U.S. economy over $1 trillion in avoided medical costs and shutdowns. I mean, when you compare that impact to, say, the Apollo program, which was amazing, of course, OWS cost less and provided a far greater immediate, measurable human and economic return.
It really proves that when the government decides to prioritize implementation speed and scale, it can overcome this inertia of scarcity we've been talking about.
It absolutely can.
But implementation isn't just about throwing money at a problem, is it? It's also about maintaining capacity, retaining talent, which ties directly into this issue of offshoring American inventions. We invent it here, but it gets made somewhere else.
Yeah, that's a huge problem. Look at semiconductor manufacturing. The U.S. used to dominate. We had like 37% of the global share back in 1990.
And now?
By 2020, that was down to just 12%. And part of the reason is that manufacturing, the actual making of the things, that's where the next generation of learning happens.
What do you mean?
Well, if we invent the new chip design here in a lab, but then we build the factory, the fab, in Taiwan or South Korea, we lose the crucial operational expertise, we lose the density of the supply chain around the factory, and maybe most importantly, we lose the opportunity for the next breakthrough that often comes from someone standing on the factory floor, solving a practical production problem, and realizing, hey, we could do this totally differently.
Right, the hands-on learning gets outsourced.
Exactly. And this loss of manufacturing capacity, it's made worse by our self-imposed talent constraints.
You're talking about immigration.
Yeah, the sources are crystal clear on this. Immigrants are like the secret ingredient to U.S. scientific and technological success. Just look at the Nobel Prizes. Immigrants account for 38% of U.S. Nobel Prizes in science since the year 2000.
38%? That's huge.
It's massive. Yet, the H-1B visa cap, the main route for skilled workers to come here, has been stuck at 85,000 per year for ages. It hasn't kept pace with the economy or global talent pools.
Creating an artificial scarcity of talent.
Exactly. It means that brilliant foreign students and researchers, often educated at top U.S. universities, pouring money into our system, working in cutting-edge fields like AI, synthetic biology, they're often forced to leave the country right after graduation because they can't get a visa.
So we're basically training our competition.
We risk pushing the next Catalan Carrico, the next person with a potentially world-changing idea, to work in a different country, simply because of a static, decades-old visa quota. We're basically guaranteeing that some of the next big breakthroughs will happen somewhere else. It's shooting ourselves in the foot.
Okay, so pulling these threads together, housing, infrastructure, innovation, the common theme seems to be this systemic shift away from what the sources are calling a liberalism that builds. And this shift really seems to have its roots firmly planted in the 1970s.
Yeah, the 70s emerged as this really pivotal decade. And we have to emphasize, the initial impulse back then was often necessary, even vital.
Right, you mean the environmental movement, consumer safety?
Exactly. People like Ralph Nader, the creation of the EPA, the Clean Air Act. And remember, Richard Nixon, a Republican, was actually a hugely consequential environmentalist president. This was a response to genuine catastrophic industrial recklessness in the 1960s. Cities were choking on smog, rivers were literally catching fire.
So the government was seen as reckless, prioritizing corporate profit over public health. Action was needed.
Absolutely. And the movement had incredible success. Between 1970 and 2020, the combined emissions of the 6 most common air pollutants dropped by something like 80%. A huge victory.
There was an overcorrection.
That's the argument. This necessary movement led to what scholars call adversarial legalism.
Adversarial legalism, what's that?
It's basically the procedural architecture that grew out of that era. Reformers, deeply distrustful of government and industry after the abuses of the 60s, turned to the courts. They started suing the government and suing companies to enforce accountability, to make sure rules were followed. The goal was to slow the system down, force deliberation, investigate every potential harm, and stop bad things from happening.
Okay, use the legal system as a brake.
Precisely. And the clearest, maybe most impactful consequence of this is seen in California's experience with its landmark environmental law, CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act.
Right, CEQA comes up constantly in these debates.
Because following this key court decision in 1972, Friends of Mammoth, CEQA's reach, just expanded dramatically. It went from being a law intended to make government agencies simply consider the environmental impacts of their decisions,
which sounds reasonable,
to becoming this powerful legal weapon that could be used by pretty much anyone, a neighbor, a rival business, a union, to stop almost anything that required any kind of public permit.
Wow. So not just big factories, but housing too.
Oh, yeah. Every large project, whether it was a highway, an apartment complex, even sometimes small infill housing, became subject to potentially years of litigation and environmental review, often initiated by local opponents whose primary goals had absolutely nothing to do with protecting the environment. Maybe they just didn't want more traffic or different people moving in. FEA gave them the tool.
So the paradox is the procedural architecture designed specifically to block dirty growth coal plants, polluting factories now routinely blocks green growth too.
That's the deep irony. The same laws that help clean up the air are now being used by local opposition groups to stall or kill solar farms, wind projects, the electric transmission lines needed to carry renewable energy.
Nobody wants those in their backyard either.
Exactly. The sources make this crucial point. Most people do not like the idea of an oil pipeline or electric transmission line running through their backyard. Guess what? They do not like the idea of wind turbines or solar panels in their backyard either. The tool itself, adversarial legalism, giving veto power to local opponents through process, it's ideologically neutral. It just maximizes inertia. It makes it easy to stop things.
Which is why the sources argue we need to become, what was the phrase, bottleneck detectives.
Yeah, bottleneck detectives, meaning we need to stop thinking in terms of pure ideology, like all regulation is bad or all development must meet every possible goal. Instead, we need to focus pragmatically on identifying and fixing the specific structural failure, the specific bottleneck, in each industry.
And the scale required for something like the clean energy transition just makes our current system seem completely unworkable, doesn't it?
The numbers are genuinely staggering. Just to meet a sort of middle-of-the-road renewable energy target, the U.S. needs to build and bring online 2 new, large 400-megawatt solar facilities. These things cover thousands of acres each every single week for the next 30 years.
Every week for 30 years.
Yeah. That's a speed of construction, and more importantly, a speed of permitting, that our current processes, trapped in this adversarial legalism quicksand, simply cannot handle. Not even close.
And this slow pace isn't just about climate goals anymore, is it? It has immediate economic consequences. We mentioned artificial intelligence earlier.
Right. AI data centers are becoming a huge driver of new energy demand. They are massive consumers of power. They need huge amounts. It needs to be reliable. And increasingly, for PR and cost reasons, they want it to be cheap and clean.
So if the U.S. permitting process stays choked by these bottlenecks, these years-long delays,
then the companies building these critical data centers will look elsewhere. And they already are. Some AI executives are reportedly meeting with leaders in the Gulf states, for example, about siting their next massive data centers over there.
moving critical 21st century infrastructure and the jobs, the tax revenue that comes with it, to countries that prioritize speed over endless process.
Exactly. So this internal crisis of not being able to build, combined with this growing external pressure from competitors like China who can build rapidly, it's finally starting to crack the old political consensus, the old neoliberal order that sort of dominated politics from Reagan through Clinton.
You hear it in comments like Senator Michael Bennett's expressing that deep national anxiety when he said something like, "I sit there thinking, I wonder what they're doing in China right now."
Yeah, that captures it. China's speed, even if it's authoritarian speed, it's forcing America to reevaluate the real costs of its own self-inflicted stagnation.
And maybe that's what's spurring some of this recent bipartisan action. Things like the Biden administration's infrastructure bill, the CHPS Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, IRA.
It seems plausible. These laws, in some ways, break with that decades-long anti-build trend. They explicitly leverage external threats, competition with China, climate change, to try and force America to invest, to manufacture, and build at home again. It's like using an emergency to bypass the usual inertia.
But truly embracing a politics of abundance, making building things easier across the board, that requires more than just a few big federal bills, doesn't it? It requires really painful choices at every level.
It really does. It demands an end to what the legal scholar Michael Gerard calls trade-off denial. He has this great quote, "We don't recognize that it's too late to preserve everything we consider precious."
Poof. Meaning we can't have it all. We can't have pristine local control and affordable housing and rapid decarbonization.
It's exactly. To actually unmake this machine that privileges caution and slowness and local vetoes, it means targeting that accumulation of local rules and procedures. It means making politically difficult, unpopular decisions like broadly reducing parking requirements for new buildings, legalizing things like accessory dwelling units, ADUs, everywhere, maybe even imposing maximum time limits for how long local governments can take to issue a building permit.
So the default answer to a building permit application should basically be yes, unless there's a really compelling reason otherwise. Stopping construction should require unusual pause, not just be the default outcome because one person filed a lawsuit.
That's the kind of fundamental shift in mindset required. If we don't start making these hard, often very local, micro-level choices, maybe sacrificing a little bit of neighborhood aesthetic consistency or some feeling of absolute local control over everything, then we're likely to fail on our biggest goals, whether it's climate or affordability. Because the machine of scarcity, the machine that makes building hard, will just keep grinding on and compounding itself. #OutRowPadrick.
Wow. Okay. So this entire deep dive, it really reveals, I think, a profound truth for you, the listener, to take away. This crisis of affordability that so many people feel across housing, energy, infrastructure, it seems to be less about some inherent scarcity of resources and overwhelmingly about institutional rigidity. It's about this accumulation of procedures, particularly since the 1970s. We made a crucial choice back then, maybe initially necessary, but a choice nonetheless, to prioritize policy processes that focused really intensely on stopping bad things from happening, stopping pollution, stopping corporate recklessness.
Which was needed.
Yes.
Yeah.
But we prioritize that over actively enabling good things to be built quickly and affordably.
And, political movements really succeed when they offer people a completely new lens, a new way of seeing the world that fundamentally transforms the culture, the laws, the customs across all levels of society. That's exactly what the environmental movement did 50 years ago. It gave people a new way to see harm. So the solution here probably isn't just one new federal law or one massive spending bill. It requires something deeper. A change in our political culture that starts to reevaluate the value we place on speed, on supply, on getting things done, against the value we place on procedural perfection and avoiding all possible risk.
Okay, so here's a final provocative thought for you to consider, maybe take into your own community, your own conversations.
Yeah.
We saw how the environmental movement gave Americans this powerful new lens, a way to see abuse and toxicity everywhere, from the air we breathe to the rivers. What would it actually look like if the idea of abundance became the new political lens? If we started seeing scarcity not as inevitable, but as a policy failure?
Interesting question.
How would you change your own behavior? Or how would you challenge your community's local regulations, your zoning board meetings, your permitting office rules, if you viewed them primarily through this crucial question: what is difficult to build right now that really should be easy?